Desert, beautiful Tempe, Arizona. Well, one of us is in beautiful Tempe, Arizona. This is Politics and the Past with Robert Ferguson, brought to you by the Center for American Institutions at Arizona State University. My guest today, who we are very fortunate to have on, is Dr. Scott Lucas, professor of international politics at University College Dublin and the editor-in-chief of EA WorldView. Dr. Lucas, thank you for coming on.
Oh man, it's my privilege. Hey, a big shout out to y'all here from the very cloudy east coast of Ireland. So at least we got the sea. But a big shout out to ASU because we teach some of their students who come over for the semester, and they're absolutely top-notch folks. So keep sending them our way. It's a real pleasure.
Well, we definitely will. I got to tell you, I'm so impressed. This is my first year at Arizona State University. I'm just very impressed with the quality of the student that I'm getting to teach.
Yeah. Yeah, if only you can make sure the basketball program got up to scratch, but we'll leave that for another discussion, all right?
Right. Dr. Lucas, would you mind telling us a little bit about EA WorldView?
Yeah. EA WorldView, I started as a journalist back when I was 16 as a sports writer back in Alabama, and then was a news journalist for a while, but I went to academia for a long time. Around the start, about 25 years ago, in the run-up to Iraq 2003, I thought, look, as an academic, it takes months, years to get out there. We need to be covering on a day-to-day basis, with just as much in terms of analysis, cut to the core of what's happening. And that eventually led to EA WorldView. It launched in 2008. It started off as a U.S. politics and foreign policy site for analysis, but very quickly, I think our ethos was, if you're really going to be working with the world, you need to work with the world from the ground up. We had a series of cases that moved us that way. The mass protest in Iran in 2009. And of course, more than 16 years later, we've had a recurrence of that, sadly, brutally repressed by the Iranian regime. The events in the Middle East, the so-called Arab Spring. So we began developing coverage, for example, of Syria, which we still maintain to this day. UK and Europe, including the whole problem post-Brexit. Middle East, beyond Syria, Israel, Gaza, what has been happening there. And then when Ukraine kicked off, when the full-scale Russian invasion in 2022, we said, look, we're going to cover this on a daily basis. And here we are, what is day 1428, 1429. And that's what we're doing, as well as a lot of video, a lot of audio work, including taking this conversation and uploading it there. And it's very much to encourage a discussion, which in a world where, there's so much like, what the heck do we believe? What's reliable in terms of so-called information? Where are we misinformation, disinformation? Just to give people, first of all, give voices to the voiceless, those that sometimes don't get heard. And then for those who are out there going, okay, yeah, maybe we can get a handle on what's happening in this place, even if there are no quick fix solutions for a lot of the problems and challenges that we're talking about.
How does that help? I mean, I think there's as a Canadian who lives in the United States, one of the things that I've kind of noticed here in the United States is that it's easy to cover foreign affairs and to cover global politics from the United States with an American veneer over everything or through an American lens. How does being on the ground around the world help you maybe give a different perspective?
I think it starts off by reframing the questions and the issues, which is what are people seeing in those areas? What are their hopes? What are their challenges? What are their fears that take place? Because, and this happens amongst academics as well, amongst commentators, is quite often our frames, come in from the outside and they're imposed on that. And just to give you a very rough general sketch, because it was about the time that I went back to journalism, as well as continuing the academic work, so much of what happened with Iraq 2003 and then afterwards, because Iraq 2003 was like a very poisonous catalyst that through much of our discussions is quite often it would set up as, oh, wait a minute, we're going to approach this from the lens of, U.S. intervention must be correct, the rationale of going in and exerting American power, that must be correct. And then, of course, you got the anti-American or the not anti-American, the anti-imperialist approach, which was, look, wherever America intervenes, they're the problem. They're what went in there, right? And I was very much opposed to the intervention in Iraq in 2003 because I thought it would hurt Iraqis. I mean, Saddam Hussein is absolutely horrible. We can have that discussion. But the way that the Americans went in there, I didn't see anything good coming out of it. And regrettably, I think that was the case. If you go to Syria, when we started covering that in 2011 during the uprising of people on the ground that started in southern Syria that spread through the country, a lot of people jumped in and they were well-intentioned and they said, oh, no, 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 no. This is a case of the U.S. wanting to go in and overthrow Assad, and they're intervening. They're messing around like they did with Saddam. And I'm going, no, we have the internet. We have networks we can develop through the internet. We can find out and develop contacts. So find out from Syrians what they want. And it's not because the Obama administration ordered them to rise up. And you could apply that to Egypt or Tunisia. You can apply that to Gaza. We now have, when EA started in 2008, and our first test case of doing this the way that we do, working through electronic media, social media, our contacts, our colleagues, was what was then a 6-week Israeli war in Gaza. And at that point, you only had one news organization that was there in English. It was Al Jazeera English, had 2 reporters on top of a hotel in Gaza City, one of whom is now with NBC. And, that was it, unless you could get onto social media, which we did, to find out from Gazans who could get messages out that take place. Well, here we are in 2023, after the Hamas mass killing, then through Israel's mass killing, we had way more sources of information. We had local journalists who had been trained up or sort of developed organically. I had a friend who was involved with it, who were bringing information out of Gaza. Whether the world noticed or not is a different question, but there was much more information that was out there. And I think, if you talk about Ukraine and Russia, just to go with the frame, the frame so often when we talk about the full-scale invasion that started in February of 2022 is you would have one framing, which is very much that this was something in which the Russians had carried out an invasion and they had attacked a neighboring country and so on. But then you had another framing, which is like, this was all in NATO. This was NATO that caused this. This was the United States, and that they were trying to knock back the Kremlin and they had surrounded it and so on. Look, I was in contact with Ukrainians and with Russians. And you say, look, what's going on here? What's working on here? And you realize Ukraine, this is a hugely complex situation, which we might discuss, but there's a fundamental, which is no, this was not an issue to be anti-imperialist, at least in the sense of anti-US imperialism, that they had caused the 2014 Maidan revolution, something I've been pushing back on social today from a couple of people that continue to run the disinformation. Nor in 2022 did Vladimir Putin react because he thought he was going to be overrun by NATO. All you had to do, and people would point to it, is go to his essay in July of 2021, where he frames Ukraine and effectively delegitimizes it as a sovereign nation. It's out there. And I think then as you go on through the 4 years of the invasion, because there's always fog of war issues that we have to deal with, but now there's fog of diplomacy, fog of economics. You've got to cut through the lines to say, what do we know from the ground? What do we not know as well, to acknowledge the gaps? And then, while you not necessarily solve anything, you get into a much better position in terms of understanding what's going on.
So when you're dealing with a country like Russia, how, where there is a lot of state repression, maybe not the extreme degree of state repression that you might see in a couple of countries out there, but there's a significant degree of state repression. How are you able to stay in touch with, or how are you able to still get good information from on the ground in a place like Russia?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is, and you'll know this as well, is that the challenge quite often is when you get something that claims to be information, you have to try to validate or sometimes triangulate it, try to find corroborating sources. But being that in mind, look, the fact here is that Russia, despite the limits that exist and the oversight, Russia has social media channels that operate. People post things on social media channels. I think one of the most accessible in terms of outside Russia, you talk about is Telegram, right? You get Russian officials that will post on Telegram, each and every day. You have Russian media outlets, which in certain areas can be very revealing. So for example, the Russian business press and finance press actually will come out with a great deal of economic information. Now, some of it's official information, you have to cut through it, but some of it's telltale signs, for example, in terms of, for example, and this came out through Russian media, not through others, and that is that food production is at its lowest point since 2009 in Russia because of a combination of factors that are going on, right? Kommersant, which is one of the leading Russian dailies, has been talking very much about problems in the manufacturing sector that are there. You then have very good independent Russian media that quite often had to relocate. So with that proviso, but you talk about Moscow Times, you talk about Medusa, for example, who publish in English as well as in Russian. You then have NGOs, you have activists who have Russian links, Russian. You can go to Russian think tanks. You can go to Carnegie in Russia, for example. In other words, there, even with societies that can be repressive or relatively closed, that doesn't mean they are completely shut down in terms of information. What it sometimes means is what the information you get out of there. And I had a very good Chinese colleague who taught me this more than 20 years ago when she was talking about Chinese media, is you read between the lines. So it's not just a question of reading what's coming out from a country, but, and again, I am not a Russian specialist. That's not how I was trained, but working with those who are Russian specialists, talking about it, saying, how do I read between the lines of this type of information in terms of Russian culture, as well as the Russian political system? And that, I think, gives you quite a bit of insight that can develop. Perhaps maybe the best known Russian analyst here would be Mark Galeotti. And I think, I value a lot of what Mark says. Don't necessarily always agree with it or agree with his take on it. But you can pick up what Mark says, and then you pick up other people that I work with, some of whom contribute to EA, who will come in with different perspectives. And I think the one rule is I'm always a perpetual student on this, in the sense that no one source is going to give me the answer. No one source is going to give that. So it's just taking in as much as you can and thinking about it as this evolving dialogue in terms of, all right, not only where are we now, but what are the parameters of what could be happening in the next 6-12 months.
I'm really your comment about how the business and financial press in Russia, there still has to be reliable information coming out of it is really interesting. And I mean, there's reasons for that, right? I mean, if you're still trying to attract international investors, or you're still trying to keep a capitalist economy going, people have to trust some information in order to make investment, right? And if they think that they're only getting propaganda, then people just are not going to invest. There has to be some reliability of information, including that. And that means that being honest when there's things that are going on that are bad. Maybe not perfectly honest, but at least a degree of honesty.
Yeah, and it's also because Russia's a really large country. So you need that within Russia as well. So to give you an example which came up, which was a story that was prominent, now it's tended to recede, would have been several months ago now. We were thinking, look, Russia's got a serious issue with gasoline, with petrol inside the country, because we were getting reports of shortages that were coming out of certain places, especially I think the Far East. And in some cases, there was even rationing at this point. And we had to think, well, okay, wait a minute. First of all, that information was coming out from Russian sources, because you cannot simply keep people in the dark. They wind up going to petrol stations like there's no petrol there, right? So they've got to come up with some explanation for what is happening there. And then you had to put this all together and say how much of the explanation from within Russia matches up to what we know. Because if you're from outside Russia, you kept thinking, okay, it's the Ukrainian attacks on their oil refineries are starting to really take their toll, which they were to an extent, but there were also internal problems in Russia. If you read the Russian press, that you could talk about it. There were distribution and transport problems, which is why a lot of the shortages were out in the Far East rather than, say, being in the European Russia. It makes sense if you think about it. So it sort of was like, yeah, that the Russian press contributed to an understanding here that wasn't just a simple, they're going to be out of gasoline next week. And then on the other hand, everything is all well and good. Because it's interesting. Anytime I tend to go on videocast, or even with some of the stuff I publish in EA WorldView, when I write about the Russian economy, again, probably not like deep dive economists. I've got an economics degree, but I wouldn't say that's my main training. but when I write about the Russian economy to talk about what the prospects are, where they are, and so on, now I get people that will push back, on these videos like, oh, same thing we've heard same thing we've heard since February 2022. Russia's on the point of collapse, and it's like, well, no, that's not what this is all about. What we're talking about here, if you think about it, is what are the constraints on a wartime economy, both in terms of maintaining provision of services, maintaining infrastructure, maintaining investment, and maintaining your invasion. And the reason why that was important to emphasize is people kept talking about sanctions in an all or nothing way. They kept on talking about either the sanctions are going to be like the decisive factor that ends the invasion, or it's going to be something that, the Russians will overcome it. They have no effect whatsoever. And all you had to do, again, if you watch Russian press and watch everything, look, the sanctions did have an effect. They had an effect in terms of industrial production. They had an effect on manufacturing because certain components were more difficult to obtain. The Russian aviation industry has been really hard hit over the last few years, if you care to take a look. But then you realize also they'll carry on things like import substitution, which makes sense to try to deal with it. And so you say, look, the sanctions probably are not going to collapse the Russian economy, but the purpose of the sanctions wasn't to collapse the Russian economy. The purpose of the sanctions was to limit Russia's capacity to wage the invasion, right? And again, once you realize that, when we get to 2026, and I think a very important point in the invasion, when you link up the economics with the diplomacy, with the military side, is that the U.S. tightening the sanctions on Russia by hitting the two largest oil companies, Lukoil and Rosneft, in the autumn, and probably more importantly, hitting their customers, the secondary sanctions, that was a huge jolt to the revenue of the Russian state. And if the Russian state suffers a jolt to revenue, it faces difficult choices. Either you have to cut back the amount that you use to finance the invasion, or you have to cut back elsewhere to keep the invasion going, which I think is what they've chosen to do. It's the latter case, cutting back, for example, on social spending in 2026.
Interesting. I mean, the secondary sanctions and hitting Lukoil and Rosneft clearly have made a difference. I mean, right now, I think Urals oil is trading, officially trading about $58-$59 a barrel, maybe
What's the
mid
discount?
50s. But what's the discount? Yeah, I
What's
mean,
the
I think about
discount?
35 to $38
Yeah.
a barrel, something like that.
Yeah.
And the Russian budgeting, and I know a lot of budgeting is I know a lot of Russian revenue is off budget and various other sides of things, but the Russian budget expects $59 a barrel.
Yeah.
That's their expectation for revenue. Now, I mean, officially it is $59 a barrel, but not with the discount.
No.
China and India are not paying $59 a barrel for Russian oil.
They're not. And the prospect that they faced, and I think it's eased off a bit with India because there's a little bit of messing around here. But in December, I think at one point we had 6 of 7, the 6 of India's 7 leading refiners had either suspended or cut back on their intake of Russian oil. I think there have been reports that there's been some workarounds where a couple of them now are trying to take it through third parties, which may ease the pressure a little bit. But you can also see that the Chinese, I think, had cut purchases, at least for December, by about 30%. The Turks had cut significantly by about 30-35. Now, they may bounce back, but if they don't bounce back, and I'll just give you the spoiler now at this point. I'm very loath to make predictions. Predictions will come back to bite you in the butt every time. But in terms of a window, in terms of projections, I'm looking at like 6 to 12 months here. It's like, can this invasion be sustained beyond the next 6 to 12 months? And to go beyond the economic to the military, and thus the political. That's why I said it's such a critical period here, because I think, in part because of the economic situation, in part because of diplomatic pressure, I think this is why Russia has escalated. This is their roll of the dice with the attacks on energy infrastructure in Ukraine. I mean, they have significantly ramped up the attacks on thermal plants, on hydroelectric. At one point, the Ukrainians thought they may try to hit substations for nuclear power plants. I, you know, just full disclosure, I'm just a couple hours out of a video cast with a Ukrainian television station, very, very good one called War and Politics 24. And they, I've got one of the two that I talked to, one's in Lviv, but one's in Kyiv, and she's only got power at her home for a few hours a day. That's what they're going through right now. But, they're still keeping the economy going at this point. Ukraine's still going at this point. Once we get to warmer weather, because they're going through freezing temperatures, and that eases off a bit, I think Putin's got a difficult choice here. And I think as I talk to you, Donald Trump's envoys, Jared Kushner, Steve Witkoff, are in Moscow talking to Putin on the same day that Vladimir Zelensky is talking to Donald Trump, or has talked to Donald Trump in Davos. And, we're sitting here gaming out what happens next. And my assumption was that the Russians would reject any proposals, and they would try to bend Witkoff and Kushner, put them back in Vlad's pocket. But we're getting reports, unconfirmed reports. Zelensky's office in Ukraine is saying, look, there's an agreement to a trilateral. So Ukraine, U.S., and Russia tomorrow in the UAE in Abu Dhabi. Now, if the Russians agree to that, first of all, I'll be surprised, because I'll be very surprised in terms of them, because the Russians simply are not going to accept anything that Ukraine and Europe put on the table. They won't accept. If the Russians have agreed to the sit down, they're feeling pressure. Nothing may happen at the talks, but they're feeling pressure that they have to show up.
Do you think that Russian war aims, we're approaching the 4-year anniversary of the war here. How do you sense that Russia's war aims have changed in the last 4 years?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, February 24th, 26th, 2022. I think it's February 24th, right? The day of the attack, right? The day of the attack, or rather the night as we're talking about it, I'm in a discussion group with some great military political analysts, and the reports are coming in that the Russian special forces are in Hostomel, in the airport just outside Kyiv, and we know some of it we knew on the night, but then it picked up later on. The plans were you take Hostomel, you got your staging point, you get into Kyiv, you capture or kill Zelensky and the ministers, take over the government buildings, you install your people. It was going to be Viktor Medvedchuk, the Ukrainian who has fled and is now in Russia, and you install it, and that's it. You have taken over Ukraine. You've knocked out the government. But that story from February through April of 22, including the Istanbul talks that took place, the last time that Ukrainians and Russians really sat down together was in the midst of all this. The Russians failed. Not only did they fail to take the capital, they got kicked out of all of northern Ukraine. They got kicked out of the Kyiv region. They got kicked out of Chernihiv. And this is a huge defeat. The world's second largest army has not been able to sweep in and overwhelm a military force which is small, far smaller than that, and a president in Zelensky who was considered inexperienced. I mean, remember this. This is a guy who was an actor. He was a television comedian who has a surprise victory in 2019, who had faced Trump's blackmail that year, if anybody can remember that, who had faced pressure from Russia. And now, having not really expected the invasion, because he didn't expect it, now he's got an emergency situation. And the night of the invasion, just to talk about it, he and the ministers go outside by the lights of the mobile phones, and they record the message. And the famous line, which is now entered folklore, especially for Ukrainians, is, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition. And the fact is that those initial Putin war aims, we need to make sure that they are out there, that that's what they want. Now, what happens is that the combination of that in 2022 and then the Ukrainian counteroffensive that took back a great bit of the Northeast, right, including near Kharkiv, and then took back part of the South, especially near Kherson, including Kherson City. Now the Russians are losing more territory, and they've got to recalibrate. And if you track this war, by 2023, we were actually talking about whether the Ukrainians could sweep further. They then have their own failed counteroffensive that takes place. And I think at that point from 23, what we're settling into is that the Russians, through a grinding war of attrition, are going to try to do two things. They're going to try to occupy all of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Luhansk regions in the east. We can get into the cultural reasons for that. A lot of Russian speakers there in 2014, months of the bloody conflict that took place there after the Maidan Revolution. They also want to take the regions in the south. They would like to get all of Zaporizhia, all of Kherson. They'd like to leave the potential open. They can get all the way across to Odessa along the Black Sea coast. So they're only going to try to occupy part of Ukraine that takes place. But what they're going to try to do is they're going to try to put so much pressure on Ukraine and try to grind them down where they can get the Zelensky government out of power. And they're going to try to get it where the government in Kyiv will have to negotiate a state of permanent weakness. And by permanent weakness, I mean no security guarantees. Of course, no question that Ukraine will be going into NATO, but no significant Western military aid that comes in. No Western forces inside the country. That's an absolute red line that they would put down. And they keep Ukraine dependent in that sense. Whether or not Ukraine can try to join the EU, they don't have the security to support those economic aims. That's what they're going to try to do. And I'm sorry to give you the long-winded explanation because now I can cut to the chase. Where that is in 2023 is where we are in 2026. And there's the 5-word phrase, and you'll know it, but just to make sure that your great viewers know it as well. Root causes of the conflict. That's the Kremlin's code for we have these conditions that we will not negotiate. We will not negotiate these territorial ambitions. We will not negotiate on these security guarantees. We will not negotiate in terms of the type of Ukrainian government that we have. And I'm always careful with quoting Dmitry Medvedev, first of all, because I'm not quite sure which planet Dmitry Medvedev is, depending on which cabinet he's been raiding, and you know exactly what I'm talking about. And also because Dmitry Medvedev is there trolling all the time. But Medvedev repeated it this week. We're going to get Odessa. We're going to get all these territories. I think if you look at other Russian voices, not just Medvedev, you'll realize they still have those fundamental demands that they're not letting go of. And if you read it a step further, I don't think they'll let go of it. I don't think they'll let go of it because here's another fundamental. You not only read situations, you read people. And for Vladimir Putin, this was to be his legacy. He's in his 70s. He's been in power, 25 years. I think it's fair to say, and your other Russian specialists can correct me, I think he's got a very mixed record on Russia domestically, on how Russia has developed. He has a very mixed record on Russia internationally. I think it is, he has not achieved in establishing it as a global power. I think it is isolated in many respects. But here he could go back to his people and say, we got Ukraine. We got, it's part of greater Russia. This centuries-old ambition. And you know how Putin, you know the stories about how Putin likes to talk to people. This is why he blew up the Alaska summit with Trump in August. He started talking to Trump about Russian medieval history. And Trump's going, what? I thought I was going to get the Nobel Peace Prize. And so, and this is Putin's read. This was to be his legacy. It's hard to give up a legacy, man. No matter how difficult it might be to achieve it, it is hard to give up a legacy. Because if he doesn't take all of the Donbass, that's a failure, point blank. He might have all of Luhansk and part of Donetsk, but it's a failure.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, yeah, absolutely. One of the earlier in the conversation, you mentioned this interesting comment about how Russian food production is as low as it's been since 2009. I honestly think one of the legitimate things you can credit the Putin administration with inside of Russia domestically was completely restarting their food production or their agricultural industry. I mean, Russia has this, back in the imperial age, it was the grain basket of the world along with the United States, arguably some of the greatest, soil in the world, for growing grain along with Ukraine. And yet in the Soviet era, agriculture, as any historian or anybody who's read the history of the Soviet Union knows, the agriculture in that region was largely destroyed. And
Yeah.
so and in the 1990s, Russian agriculture had not really recovered, but it wasn't until Putin took power in 2000 that he made some very serious structural changes, not changes that I necessarily would have recommended, but he made serious structural changes that brought Russian agriculture back to a point that was comparable in Russian history. And if we're at the point now where Russian food production is back to where it was, better than in the 90s in
Yeah.
2009, but still like that's a significant step back. That's a calcification rather than an improvement. I mean, that's pretty damning of the domestic situation in Russia, where one of his legitimate accomplishments is now under fundamental threat.
Yeah, but he's putting it all on the line for that, and he's putting it all on the line. And if you look at the rhetoric of the Kremlin, the rhetoric of those allied with the Kremlin, the whole idea that it's worth the sacrifice. It's worth the sacrifice because we're going to get Ukraine, right? But just to elucidate on that, because I always find it interesting. I'm learning from you here because it makes me link up things. If you think about this and put it in the wider trajectory of the conflict, one of the motives for going into Ukraine, from first point, is Ukraine's got a big agricultural sector, just like you talked about. The breadbasket of the world, they used to call themselves. And one of the big setbacks that people do not recall is that at the same time when Russia's trying to sweep through and take Ukrainian territory, they blockaded the Black Sea ports, right? They've absolutely choked off the Black Sea ports. And when we finally get a history of this being written, there better be a chapter on how Ukraine broke that blockade. I mean, the absolute, the counterattack against Russian naval forces in the Black Sea, and then combined with the diplomacy where they could open up that corridor in the Black Sea, and Russia has not been able to close it back. So what you've had is, on the one hand, you haven't been able to starve Ukraine out, which is what they were trying to do. And on the other hand, your own food production is sinking. And we're actually seeing that kind of thing in terms of energy sector as well. That's why energy sector is so vital at this point. That Russia, on the one hand, is trying to freeze out Ukraine, but at the same point, have got serious problems now in their energy sector. I mean, they've got serious problems now in terms of the economic effects of the sanctions that are taking place. You talk about, for example, again, Lukoil and Rosneft, my understanding is they're going to lose a lot of their foreign-based assets, right? They're going to have to sell up or be pushed out. If you talk about the damage to the infrastructure that's taken place in terms of the energy sector inside Russia. And so now Putin's narrative changes from look at what we're going to acquire to, well, look at what we have to persist. We have to persist that takes place. And I'm just always cautious, though, and this is with some of my colleagues, who say, well, that's it. This counterattack is broken Russia or could break Russia. And this is where I defer to Russian experts is, look, my understanding of Russian history, especially on a video cast talking about the past, is that you have a cultural narrative, which is one which is built around sacrifice quite often. And Russians have sacrificed. And we can talk about the World War II sacrifice in a defensive position. We can talk about the sacrifice that has occurred when they've gone on various adventures, even Afghanistan in the 1980s, right? How long can you carry on with a narrative of sacrifice and maintain legitimacy with enough of your population to persist? I'm not smart enough to answer that, but that's the question in my head.
I mean, the only parallel I can think of is 1917.
Okay, yeah.
That's the only example I can think of where eventually the Russian government asked the Russian people to sacrifice too much.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess we got to that point in the 80s. I guess, the combination of adventures like Afghanistan and then internally, and that's when Gorbachev finally has to change the narrative and, perestroika, glasnost, and off we go. I think the difference here is... Yeah, go ahead.
But I was just going to say, but in that case, Western banks had extended so much credit into Russia that, there was a leash that was applied as well after a certain point.
Yeah.
but in this case, that's not the situation. It's not like, in the 80s and the early 90s, with those Western loans, Western governments could say, hey, we're not going to underwrite these loans anymore, and that allowed a certain amount of control over the situation
Oh, okay.
that this time we're not going to see. We don't have
Right.
that
Okay. So
capability, at least.
okay. So sanctions can't exert that control in a very different instrument. I understand sanctions can't exert that control. I think that's fair enough. I think the other thing is, and again, be interested, because you're doing a great job with these video casts. So to learn from you, and the answer to this question is, you had a new politician in Gorbachev in the 80s, or someone who went a new way. I can't see, who, if everybody said, look, Putin, you've done your best. It's time for you to walk. You haven't been able to achieve it. Someone else go in and reframe this. I can't see who that would be at this point. Um,
The
you know,
United
I,
Russia is not the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, right? It doesn't have the same type of, its ideology is so personalized that,
yeah,
you
yeah,
almost can't imagine a successor in the same way that even though the Communist Party of the Soviet Union post Brezhnev didn't have a lot of great successors lined up, there was at least like an established uh, protocol for promotion.
yeah, okay, yeah,
And
and so there's no political figure of stature. Again, Medvedev's off in the cabinet somewhere, so it ain't gonna be him. And Shoigu's been sent off playing at being Secretary of the National Security Council. So yeah, okay. How serious? By the way, look, I'm good. How serious was the Prigozhin challenge in 2023 from
that's a
not just
great
a
question.
military but political standpoint? Yeah,
My sense is that's been the greatest threat that Putin's actually faced. The
that's what I
greatest
thought as
acute
well.
threat.
That's what I thought. And the one thing I don't have a read on again is how many people within the Russian military were actually working with Prigozhin or willing to accept Prigozhin at that point in 23, and how many of them remain within the military, but now 2.5 years later. Um,
I mean, I think my sense is intelligently, most of those Russian officers that would have been in the position to make such a decision, we're not going to put them, and they would have just said, you're breaking up. I can't quite get, I'm not
right.
quite getting the order here. What's going on? Oh, you want me to go this way, right, or that way? Um, so it's hard to say. What I do think it tells you a lot about that situation is the fact that, it tells you a couple of things. First of all, though, that there certainly wasn't the ability to stop those forces for a
Yeah,
very
it's
long
true.
time. They
Yeah,
made it awfully close to Moscow
yeah,
in a matter of
yeah,
hours.
yeah,
I think that tells you two things. One, it tells you there wasn't really the ability to stop them, maybe not really the significant, overwhelming desire to stop them. And the other thing is, I do think this speaks to Russian strategic paranoia, is that if you had a pretty significant hostile force in Ukraine, the Russian heartland is wide open to you, to an invading force from the south. We look at 1942. I mean, Army Group South, they were probably the greatest threat, actually, and they made the
yeah,
most progress in that
yeah,
invasion. And I think Putin certainly feels that. And so that corridor north from Ukraine, especially once you get around the Pinsk marshes, uh, is their underbelly.
yeah.
And
Okay.
Prigozhin was going right up that invasion route. But I mean, I
Yeah,
think the politics are probably more interesting, and that's the sense that I think people were going to let that play out in Russia.
yeah. It is. I mean, I still wonder if Prigozhin was as good a politician as he was uh, a militia figure at that point. Russian history would have been very different. Would have played out very
Well,
differently at that point.
I'd have been satisfied if he was as good a politician as he was a chef.
That's a fair point. That's a very fair point. I'll take that. Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yeah. But I think, but if we bring it back around here, what I'm sort of saying, um, and again, just full disclosure, it's being in that interesting position where I'm doing two video casts a week with this Ukrainian channel. So, you talk to him about what's happening and then just lay it out to him. So, yeah, I think realistically here, this, they asked me today, they said, look, every time that Trump and Witkoff say, "Oh, peace is around the corner," and I say, "Well, look, if I had a dollar or a ruble, even a ruble for every time they said that, I'd be a wealthy guy. I wouldn't be talking to you." And I have this sense that we're still in a marathon here. We are not in a sprint here. And whether it accelerates and we get 6 months from now, but I just think this is going to keep going, to be honest with you.
I I I fear that you're right. One of the things about war is about asking very difficult political questions of your opponent. And in this case, I don't think either Ukraine or Russia are done asking each other questions yet.
No, they're not. The question is how they're answering the questions. We'll see how it comes out of Witkoff and Kushner today, which comes out of Moscow. But I will say, and maybe we could pick up, I'd love to chat to you again, but if you were to pick it up off the Ukraine side, I think what's been interesting off the Ukrainian side has been a great deal of adjustment in the last few months on the and this is something that doesn't get as much play in the discussions. I think Zelensky faced one of his most serious challenges to his own rule, and that was from within Ukraine, which was the corruption scandals. And I think the interesting point here is I've got a lot of time for Zelensky. It's not like yay Vladimir, but I've got a lot of time for Zelensky in terms of watching how he maneuvers and so on. He had a chief of staff who was absolutely corrupt, and the investigators are now saying that. And he was dragging Zelensky down. Okay, Andrei Yermak is gone. He's been replaced by Kirill Budanov, who was head of military intelligence and one of the most respected figures in Ukraine by Ukrainians. So they have shored that up. They also, because of that major scandal in their nuclear energy industry, basically kickbacks that were taking place, they got rid of the energy minister, got rid of the deputy, I think it was deputy prime minister. They got rid of several high-ranking ministers. They've come through it, I think, on the other side. And the interesting thing to watch with is when you're asking questions, they've got a new defense minister, Mikhailo Fedorov, who's only in his 30s, but has been responsible in terms of not just drones, but also digitalization. And if you ask Ukrainians, one of the big things that they've done recently, they've connected everybody through their phones to services. All your services available on an app on the phone, despite the fact they're in wartime. So that meant that when Russia played the cards of, you have to have the elections now, right? That Zelensky could kick it back and say, look, as soon as we get the ceasefire, 60 to 90 days, okay? We're going to go to it. And that even though Zelensky might lose an election, because I think, it would be very close between him and the former military commander-in-chief, Zaluzhny. At least the fact that Ukrainians can see that they've got a process if they get out of this continues to mean that they've got legitimacy. That Kyiv government's got legitimacy. Then you kick it back with all the things we're talking about in Moscow, and can you ask serious questions to Moscow about the legitimacy of its special military operation? Can you ask those serious questions in the next 6 months?
Yeah. Yeah, actually, in fact, one of the shows that I've got coming up in a couple of weeks is with a gentleman who's he lives in Transcarpathia, and he's a really good Ukrainian political, does a lot of deep dive into Ukrainian politics. And our goal is to talk about what Zelensky's domestic political position actually is in the country.
I would be your first viewer on that, man. I'd be absolutely first viewer to get into that.
But anyway, so what at this point we've actually I'm going to go back to the corruption scandal a little bit. Where are we at? And maybe we're a little too inside baseball here, but I know that Yulia Tymoshenko's name came up again in another corruption scandal. Where's that?
Tymoshenko's on bail. I think she was bailed for about I think it was the equivalent of $800,000, if I remember correctly. So it's pretty high bail that was set. And she gave this speech out. You'll never push Tymoshenko out of Ukraine. Yeah. Look, the thing here is it got headlines because Tymoshenko, of course, is a key figure going back to the 2004 revolution because she had continued to stand for president. But her party, I think, had maybe 25 out of 450 seats in the Ukrainian parliament. It was not a significant force that took place. And so it was, although it's important for transparency for Ukrainians and I'll give you a comparison in a minute that just highlights this conflict. It was important that she face accountability because the accusation is pretty serious, which was paying off people for votes. Given that her party doesn't have a large bloc, she's trying to get others to come in there and come in and be on her side on legislation. I think the far more serious cases than Tymoshenko, which have run for months, were the scandals within the defense ministry. Now, this goes back to 2023 when the defense minister was Resnikov. And this was the tenders that were supposedly going out for basic supplies for the army, including food. And people were getting money to get the tenders, and they were at inflated prices and all of that. Then you had the combination, however, and this is why it was really serious. You had to remember that with Ukraine being attacked by the missiles and the drones trying to knock out the energy infrastructure, here you have the corruption scandal in the energy industry, in the nuclear energy industry, and the fact that it is Yermak. And for those of you who follow, Ukrainian events, Zelensky, the way Ukrainian politics works is you got to have some influential people, some schemers who are working with you. Right? This isn't an angels or devils thing that takes place. Yermak was one of those people. And the fact is that a lot of people knew in Ukraine that he was dodgy. A lot of Western people knew he was dodgy. If you go back and look over the past couple of years, articles that came out from European and American officials about Yermak, you can start reading what they're talking about, that he needed to go. When Parliament threatened to effectively neuter the anti-corruption bureaus, there are two of them in Ukraine that are important. When they threatened legislation that would have put them under a political prosecutor that would have just basically shut down their autonomy, and Zelensky temporarily signed it and then pulled back, thank goodness, there were mass protests that took place about this attempt. The crowds were chanting Yermak's name. They were blaming him for what was taking place. If you do not get rid of Yermak, you've got something corrosive right at the top of government. So it was a question that he had to go. But you had to take him out with a proper process, because there's a big difference between Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine, which has had a long history of corruption, as does Russia. Ukraine's had a long history of corruption. One of the things that they did post-2014 were set up the anti-corruption agencies. And those anti-corruption agencies have they've been above board. They're doing what they're supposed to try to do. As we saw in that episode last summer, you have got to let them operate and not try to shut them down. So Yermak had to be taken out by an investigation, not politically. Politically, you get people scrapping and so on. And they got him. They got him with evidence. It still would have to be tried in court, but of course he's fled. He's in absentia now. That, for many Ukrainians, was a sign of the system worked. The system worked at that point. And they didn't have to play whataboutism and say, oh, but Russia, go look at Russia. And it's like, oh no, okay, you got to deal with it here at home. And I think that gives Zelensky a little bit of leeway as we go through the current energy crisis, because the huge political scrap right now is between him and Mayor Klitschko in Kyiv, the former boxer, heavyweight boxer. They do not get along. They're rival political machines, and I won't go into it. But basically, both are blaming each other for the fact that Kyiv has been without power for significant periods of time for the past few weeks because of the attacks. And that's just the type of thing Ukraine will go through. But I think as a fundamental, and maybe I can spare your great viewers now, because I have wittered on for quite long. So maybe I can jump after this. But I think what I would say to you is, that there is a fundamental here that we're almost coming up to the 4-year anniversary. And if you could have said in February 22 that politically, economically, and militarily that Ukraine would survive this, who would have gone down to the bookies and placed a bet on that? I mean, who would have gone down to it? And we could bring up cultural legends about how brave the Ukrainians are and so on, and they are brave. That it's not just a legend. But the fact is that, 4 years later, and so every time Trump comes out and gives Putin a pass, and as I speak to you, of course, Putin has the invitation to join the Board of Peace for Gaza, while he is still under an arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court for the abduction of Ukrainian children. So get your head around that. He's on Trump's board of peace while being wanted for arrest. And every time that Trump goes after Zelensky, that he supposedly only has 4% support, that it's corrupt and so on. Look, flawed system, Ukrainian system, flawed system, but man, it's still going. Still on, it's not on its knees.
Yeah. Can we expect more, especially as this game is being, I mean, this war is being played out at the diplomatic tables and across the world as well. Can we expect more attacks like the Oreshnik attack that we saw a couple of weeks ago from the Russians? More missile strikes like that, do you think? Or
well, it was a one time. It was a one time that may repeat itself. I mean, okay, that's the second time the Oreshnik's been used. All right. So why is it used at that point? Where is it used? Okay, it's used near Lviv. What Lviv is about 60 kilometers from the Polish border. Right. So why are they firing it then? Because we were in the midst of the discussion of the Ukraine-Europe proposals. And we have to see if those are the proposals that Witkoff and Kushner put to Putin today. But those Ukraine-Europe proposals had gotten to the point where not only did you have security guarantees, which would include European forces, probably British and French, inside Ukraine, but the Americans had agreed to participate. And what had the Americans agreed to do? They had agreed to oversee aerial operations. Where would those aerial operations be based? They wouldn't be based in Ukraine. They would be based in a neighboring country. What is a possible candidate for one of the neighboring countries where you could have the U.S. supervising the operations? Poland. That's, I can't guarantee you, I'm not there when Putin makes the decision and so on, but that to me is the read on why they fire the Oreshnik at that location, which is we can do this. It could have a more powerful warhead on it than the one we actually sent over this time. So if the conditions get such that they feel cornered, then they could do it again. What I'm watching for today, and I'd love to come back and talk to you this because we'll see how it plays out, is because we got like two things you got to read signals off of. You got to read it whether Zelensky played Trump well to keep Trump in a good mood, where he doesn't wind up falling under J.D. Vance's spell again, like he did last February in ambushing. But then you got to read Witkoff, a real estate developer, and Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, who simply is a money guy. Do they honestly put forward the Ukraine-Europe proposals, which they've agreed to? Do they honestly put those forward today? Or do the Kremlin get them to set that aside and get back to the ultimatum that Witkoff and Kushner crafted with Putin's finance guy, Kirill Dmitriev, in late October? This is the challenge of an analyst. There's not a single possibility here. It's like billiard balls on a flaming table, right? And that's why I teased with you the fact that what we're watching for tomorrow is, does this trilateral meeting come off? Which gives us another point of reference. Do we say, okay, we've gotten to this point, then what's next?
all right, well, Dr. Lucas, I don't want to take up any more of your time. You've been gracious enough. Thank you very much for coming on. It's been a great discussion, and I hope January in Dublin is a little more cheery than maybe it's been so far.
Well, look, you come over here, I'll buy you a pint of Guinness, and we won't worry about the weather. Hey, my thanks to your viewers, and look, I would love to do this again, so really appreciate it.
Thanks very much.